one more thing I want to say about it, and then I'll get into the book, and that is we talked about the importance of Hildegard Gossmeier as a skillfully done intervention where you have something that these people need. And so you're not going to be such an ideologue that you're going to say, oh, I come from Western Europe, I speak an Indo-European language, so I'm going to downgrade myself and I can't teach an indigenous person anything. That's, I think, an extreme and an error. The other extreme is peace imperialism, where you say, these people are off-white in their skin color, therefore they don't know anything, so we got to go in and fix them. That's also very undesirable and very ineffective, counterproductive. But you go in and say, I have some stuff that might help you. Let's see how we can get it together, elicit the capacities that you have, and I will help you develop them because I have had the leisure to study nonviolence my whole life. And you've been on Mount Smoky trying to get a pair of busted old huaraches out of there so you can sell them in the market and maybe get one meal for your kid. So that's what we were mainly talking about in her connection, but there's another point to be made, and that is that sometimes your intervener, and she was a good example of this, can provide a connection to the international community. And this brings us to another wonderful concept that was formulated by Johann Galtung. He's a great wordsmith. Johann Galtung is, we really owe him a lot of this vocabulary. He calls this the great chain of nonviolence. And we're going to see some examples of this in the reading. So, of course, he's thinking about the great chain of being, which is a medieval theological concept, and he's playing off of that. But let's think for a minute about Martin Luther King Jr. There he is, the people that he's working for are like domestic servants or, laborers, things like that. There's not a way in the world that they could talk to the President of the United States. And that's how the world is going, right? I mean, I remember when I wanted to start peace and conflict studies, I called the Chancellor. I said, hey, Mike. I said, no. But we were pretty chummy. I said, I got an idea. I want to talk to you about it. I said, okay, come to the faculty club. Let's have some beer and talk about that. That seemed to be the essentials for having a conversation with the Chancellor was that you had to knock back about 3 beers before the conversation got serious. Well, okay, in the present instance, that conversation went nowhere. I got a little tipsy, but otherwise I got nothing out of this. But the fact is I could talk to him. And now that's just about impossible. An ordinary line professor, I cannot call the Chancellor, even though I can pronounce his name pretty well, and say, let's go to the club and knock back a few Heinekens. I've got a scheme to talk to you about. No, I don't think so. So there's a question, a problem of access, and we're going to see, you've already seen, I guess, in some of the readings, that very successful nonviolent movements come from both above and below. And that happened in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet bloc, a lot. But how is that communication going to be effective? Because an average housewife cannot talk to the powers that be. But a friendship very often sprang up in the South between the domestic workers and the white women that they were working for. There's a certain bond of understanding that they had with both women trying to run this household. They often ended up friends, and that was very important. You're going to see a clip from a film called The Long Walk Home, which can show you the political results of that kind of friendship on the one-to-one level. And if you were to see the whole film, A Long Walk Home, you'll see there's a moment when her domestic servant, played by Whoopi Goldberg, is harassed by the police. So Whoopi Goldberg's employer just gets on the phone, talks to the sheriff, like I used to talk to the Chancellor, and they bring the policeman into the house and he has to apologize to that woman. So, although the oppressed people have no direct access to people on the top of the power hierarchy, they can have indirect access, and that can be stage by stage by stage by stage, until you get somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. who can actually walk into the Oval Office and sing a few choruses of We Shall Overcome and get some legislation passed. So on the international level, having someone like Hildegard Gossmeier in the Philippines was important for that also, because she was able to alert the peace community in the whole global north that stuff like this was going on in the Philippines and get them some representation. Theoretically, if this had gone on, she could even have gotten through to the then President of the United States. I forget his name. He's the one who's the screen actor, the one with the chimpanzee. I keep forgetting his name. But he actually called Marcos at one point and said, don't fire on that crowd. So that was very useful. He played a useful role there. Okay, so that's the concept I wanted to help you pull out of the reading. And now let's go to the book. And I'm going right back to the Iranian Revolution for a bit. And let's see. I'm on page 45, middle paragraph. Just you can just jot down these numbers if you didn't bring the book with you. This is the book I'm talking about again, Nonviolent Social Revolutions. We might get one of the editors over here. He teaches in San Francisco. We have a collection and get Bard Fair together. He'll probably come over and talk to us. The mobilization of the masses by clandestinely smuggled audio cassette tapes. Remember, this is the middle 70s. Audio cassette tapes are pretty high tech. They're pretty snazzy stuff. This is think iPods, okay, or whatever is coming next. I don't know. The mobilization of the masses by clandestinely smuggled audio cassette tapes led Abdul Hassan Sadeh, an official with the Ministry of National Guidance, to note that, quote, tape cassettes are stronger than fighter planes. This is nice because, again, nonviolence is a different kind of power. It doesn't need a whole lot of armor and metal around it. I remember one of the peace movements in Germany in the 80s, there was a big demonstration. There's a picture of a dinosaur on it, and the slogan was, Ausgestorben, zu viel Panzer, zu wenig Hirn, which means extinct, too much armor, too little brain. So the kind of power that nonviolence likes to use is softer power. Costs a lot less, hurts a lot less, but we shouldn't think that it's less strong for that. And this is where forces of repression are often vulnerable. Not always, but they can often be vulnerable because they don't realize the power of ideas, concepts. They think just bigger whips and bigger tanks and stuff like that, and more Abu Ghraibs and Guantanamos and everything will be fine. But as Gandhi said, there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So I said that's sometimes a weakness of theirs. There are some regimes that are so clever that, in fact, they outmaneuver the progressive forces with their manipulation of ideas. In fact, I think that's what's going on in our world today. It's because we have this massive commercial culture that's working against us. But we'll talk about that repeatedly and at greater length under other circumstances. But that's an important thing to note, that in Chile and in Iran and in Poland and other parts of the Soviet bloc, the regime didn't realize that access to media could be that important, and then they quickly lost legitimacy when people were able to work through all their lies and propaganda and get some better ideas in people's heads. Now, mostly this uprising, the Iranian uprising, and I checked this out with my next door neighbor, Dariush Zahedi. It's very nice to work in international and area studies. You just got most of the world is right down the corridor there. And Dariush said that, in fact, yes, this was almost entirely a nonviolent uprising, non-dash violent, he didn't say that, but I'm saying this, non-dash violent uprising, in the sense not that the people were trying to love the Shah, that would be very hard to do, but that they were not going to use abusive, injurious force in their movement. However, as the chapter points out, there were a couple of episodes in which, and that's, hang on a second, okay, sorry, I'm not finding it right away, but there were episodes of violence, and very extreme violence. And this is a problem that has plagued us to the present day, the Nagler's Law issue. And I think what I'll do, in the interest of time, is leave it with you as a question, and there are going to be 3 or 4 questions like this. Okay? If you were inventing the peace movement today, how would you deal with the problem of unconverted participants who, though small in number, can be so tremendously damaging? For one of the early cases, the Ruhrkampf, the battle for the Ruhr, almost entirely nonviolent, but a few people fired a few shots through these wooden chutes, sabotage, or sabot was a wooden chute, and then the police were able to crack down immediately. And the suspicion is that those were not protesters, but agents provocateurs, as they call it, people who infiltrated from the military, from police, to get them to throw stones. So the problem is twofold. I'm going to try and take a few minutes at the end of this class today so you can hear from Artie, and on Tuesday from Amy, about how they've been facing this issue right now. People who are outraged about the right thing, don't get me wrong, but they don't know how to turn their anger away from bitterness. That's another useful word, by the way, that came up last semester in the documentary A Time for Justice. Keep it out, the bitterness element, which turns it into a personal vendetta. So how are we going to deal with people, and when the time comes that we need numbers, how are we going to mobilize numbers and make sure that there won't be somebody or somebody's in the group that's blowing it? And then, of course, there's the question of outsiders coming in and doing that deliberately because they're a little smarter than us, and they know their little violence will mess us up completely. In fact, another episode where that happened most probably was there was a student strike at Columbia University in the 70s. A strike went on for 24 hours, and there was, in those 24 hours, there was one moment of, I guess we can call it violence, it was disruption, throwing stuff, cursing, stuff like that. So you have 23 hours and 59 minutes of nonviolence and 1 minute of violence. And the media coverage that night in all New York major television channels, they said, we'll give it 1 minute. So what do you think they did? Obviously, they took the 1 minute where there was violence happening. And it later turned out that that wasn't even students. It was somebody who came in from the outside. Okay, so keep that question in your mind now. How are we going to deal with this? And let's see. Yeah. At the bottom of page 45, once in power, the Islamic regime proved to abandon its nonviolent methodology, particularly in the period after its dramatic shift to the right in the spring of 1981. And my colleague, Professor Zahedi, said that this was actually the Ayatollah's plan all along, and he had been lying to the people and getting them to lay down their lives and sacrifice, it must be our blood, not theirs, all of this stuff, just fully intending to be as repressive as the Shah had been all along. So this is another question for us. How are we going to fix this recurrent problem that when a nonviolent, we're thinking now of insurrections, but it could apply to reform movements also, when a nonviolent insurrection is successful, power goes to the head, and people tend to forget what gave them their success, and they jump off the train, as Gandhi said, we were heading for Rishikesh, they jumped off at Delhi, and unfortunately, you just cycle back. All you end up doing, in this case, is reorganizing power, not mobilizing a different kind of power. So you remember my famous slogan, which is I'm sure is going to be a very successful bumper sticker someday. It's not about a different kind of people in power, it's about a different kind of power in people. So think about that also. These are questions that are quite real. I mean, if we come up with answers to these questions, as you're going to hear very shortly, we can pump these answers directly into the peace movements. This is not just for you to write papers and amuse me on the final exam. This could be extremely useful, both of these questions. Okay, so now I'm turning my attention to the first Intifada, again, which was, as we said, a success. It was similar to the problem that we were just talking about, a success which was not capitalized on. And what happened there? What happened was people carried out this uprising to the point where they got a seat at the negotiating table, and then they decided, okay, we have won, and they went back to their same old, and let the negotiators take it forward from there. And unfortunately, the negotiators were not very successful in Madrid in 1991, and almost none of the concessions that had been forced out of the Israelis by the nonviolent Intifada stuck. Here's a very sad example of the same thing. It's the Prague Spring uprising of 1968. It was brilliant. We're going to be talking about that in detail in just a bit. But again, it was kind of a nonviolent moment. Just in a couple of weeks, they had really brought the country to a standstill. They kept the Warsaw Pact armies at bay. And then what happened was the Kremlin invited the leaders to Moscow for discussion, Russian style. By the time they came back to Czech, well, even before they got back to Czechoslovakia, they got to the airport and found that one of their men wasn't with them because the Russians were taking him to prison. And they sat there in the airport and said, we're not going back without him. And eventually he had to be released. So that was a good thing. That was using nonviolence correctly. You risk yourself to maintain solidarity with the threatened other. But the fact is that they were jawboned into basically selling out the revolution. Not to put too fine a face on it, that's what they had to do. So here they get up in Wenceslas Square and they stand there. Dubček himself was just shedding tears copiously, and they said, here's how it's going to be. And basically, it's at that point that the revolution lost its firmeza permanente, and ultimately it was overcome. So, yeah, Michael? Well, I imagine they sat around the table and the Soviets told them, if you keep this up, this is what we're going to do, and they threatened them, and they cajoled them, and they jawboned them into accepting some kind of concessions, which when you're in that environment, it seems like, okay, it's a good idea, but when you go back and face your people, you realize what you've done. You really sold it out. So if you guys can stand it, I want to leave that as an open question also. Maybe at the end of the semester we should design the ideal nonviolent insurrection and, blueprint it and sell it, whatever, give the money to Netto or something like that. But it's an interesting question which is partly strategic and partly principled. That's why I think it's useful for us. How are we going to prevent this kind of thing from happening? The movement gets handed up the great chain of non-being, and the great chain of nonviolence, and when it gets to the top, people think, okay, that's what we were after, we won. You go and relax, and it turns out that those people are not in a position to carry forward with your ideas. Okay. I want to draw your attention to two things that are on page 47, paragraph 2. 47.2 is the way I do it, if you must be fast. The Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence documented this uprising, and that's the organization that was started by Mubarak Awad, someone I'm very proud to call my friend and who has often spoken in this class. And we talked about how he started that thing. And many of the tactics of the Intifada were not new, but they brought this form of struggle to new heights in terms of its scope and role as a calculated strategy of resistance. That's the end of paragraph 2. So remember, some of you, when we were talking about Gandhi's tactics, that really, it might be true to say, I'm not sure I haven't actually thought this through, maybe you can help me on this, but I think it might be true to say that not a single tactic that he did was new. They either came from a spiritual tradition, like fasting and stuff like that, or they came from a kind of indigenous political canniness that was common in Indian villages. And in fact, one scholar, Joan Bondurant, who wrote one of the really early books about nonviolence, who's called Conquest of Violence, she actually taught here for a while. If she was still teaching here, I would be a lot less sassy when I talk about Barrows Hall, but there you go. Anyway, in her book, she did a repertoire listing of where all these things came from that Gandhi used. I mean, you think khadi, okay, homespun cotton, that's really Gandhian. No, but as a matter of fact, they were wearing khadi in the early years of the All Indian Congress, somewhat before Gandhi was born. Okay, so these things are simmering in the population, and again, this is partly the role of an outsider to come in and say, look, you've got this, this, and this that you can use. But what makes them now new and effective is that they're pulled together by someone who has a strategic overview and can say, now use this one, now use that one. That's the great advantage. If you know, someone who knows that you do constructive program whenever you can, and you do obstructive program when you must, and he knows how to pull them in and put in the appropriate form, that's what makes these things incredibly powerful. Now, on the bottom of the page, next to the last paragraph, Nafez Asayli, who took over the center from Mubarak, and also I can't resist saying this, also a friend of mine. I thank you for indulging me in these little things. As Nafez Asayli of the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence described the situation in 1989, he said, quote, he's talking about the Israelis. In 1967, they defeated the armies of 3 countries in 6 days, but they have yet to defeat the Intifada. That's extremely useful for us because we're looking for ways of showing comparative advantage of nonviolent power versus violent power. Okay? You remember my quoting probably from Martin Luther King that there were less people were killed in 10 years of civil rights movement in the South than were killed in 6 days of rioting in Detroit. So that's one way of looking at it. And we talked about the comparison between the Indian freedom struggle and the Algerian freedom struggle. Many more people were killed, and the outcome was horrendously wrong. But what, oh yeah, that's right, there is another very good example. The first major campaign that Gandhi did in India, which is Champaran, when he came back, was an issue that they had been struggling for 100 years, and he got more done in 3 months than they've been able to do in 100 years by mobilizing nonviolence. I'm telling you this partly because Amy and others have been coming and saying that they've been having these discussions with people, and these people are always saying nonviolence doesn't work in one form or another, and then you start telling them how it did work, and it's a lot of fun. It doesn't always mean they're going to say, oh, I understand, thank you, but it'll get in there somewhere. In the early days of peace and conflict studies, we were hearing a talk by a member of the military affairs program. I reach out. I mean, I'll even hear from Stanford people if they want to talk here. And he was saying, well, as you know, in history, it's been wars all the way down, so nothing but wars. And I said, oh, really? What about the Kyrgyz culture and this new stuff that's been coming out from this woman? And I just started to show him that for 6,000 years there was a culture called Old European, where they had basically no militarism and no sign of weapons in any of their burial sites, and no sign that there was any armed conflict, and they were perfectly happy for about 6,000 years until Indo-Europeans, types like you, with me, and some of you, started coming in from the Caucasus. And the minute I started saying those things, he changed the subject. So that's going to happen sometimes. You're not going to. It's not like you're going to get a lot of satisfaction out of this, but you will be changing things. On page 57, there's an observation by Suad Ajami. She said that women's increased activism during the Intifada earned them the wrath of some of the extremist religious groups who tended to blame Palestinian defeats on the departure from tradition and religion. Okay, 3 things I want to say about this. The power of vulnerability, and Gandhi said this a long time ago, that anybody can do nonviolence, but women are particularly good at it. Okay? I don't think of myself as either a sexist or an anti-sexist, I guess a sexist or a feminist in the essentialist sense, but for whatever reason, it seems to be the case that introducing women as a group into a movement, and we studied this in 1913 in South Africa, is more than just a quantitative difference, not just like you have